Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. Make sure I'm heard. We each have a unique experience of grief. And at times, we are alone in our grief. Our tradition acknowledges the individual experience of loss and also encourages us to reach for connection to others, precisely at these times of loss. As Jews, our way through grief is not to be alone. We see this dual truth, the individual grief and the together grief, in the memorialization of the Exodus story at Passover. We see this also in our traditional mourning practices throughout the year. And lastly, I will call on us to use this framing of individual and shared grief as we prepare for Yom HaShoah next week. First, Pesach. Pesach teaches us how to remember together. The central obligation is to gather for a Seder and to instigate a communal memorial experience using signs and symbols, asking questions, singing songs. We recount in the Haggadah in the plural, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And on Pesach, we also work to have an individual, personal experience of empathizing with our enslaved ancestors. We empathize so strongly that we assert, Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeti mi Mitzrayim. It is because of what God did for me when I left Egypt. In order to say these words with authenticity, I have to find a way to mean it. That God took me out of Egypt. I must connect myself to the ancient Israelites. And in the spiritual time travel that we do, feel myself saved as an individual, as me, and also as a part of them, also alongside them. The individual and the collective. Mourning practices, the second part. Here too we find individual and shared experiences of grief. On the one hand, there are practices that are intended to distinguish mourners from the rest of the community. They are excused from other ritual obligations from the time of the death of their loved one until burial, so that they can focus on this primary mitzvah of arranging for burial. They alone tear their clothes, or a little black ribbon attached to their clothes. They alone recite mourner's Kaddish, appropriately named. During Shiva, we have a tradition not to greet mourners, to let them have their space on their own, to wait until they greet us first. Mourners may observe other practices. Some don't leave the house during Shiva. Some don't wear leather. Some sit in low chairs in order to make their mourning tangible, physical. During Shloshim, the first 30 days, for close relatives or for a parent for the first year, some mourners do not attend celebratory gatherings, so live music, parties, movies, theater productions, weddings. These are all practices that respect the individual experience of mourning. What are the practices that are about collective experience of mourning and grief? What connects mourners to the community? I'm sure we can think of a few examples. Shiva. Going to the mourner's home and creating a Shiva experience, maybe also bringing them food. What else is a communal, collective experience as part of mourning? Couldn't hear? Making minyan. When a mourner needs to recite Kaddish, we go out of our way, and we could, as a community here at Bethel, even try harder to make this work well and to have good attendance at our daily minyan, to allow mourners to recite Kaddish with a minyan. What else? Breaking meals, creating in the mourner's home, helping them to have a meal, bringing them food, a meal of consolation even on the day of a funeral, which is also a communal gathering. Are there more? We comfort mourners. So we have, at Bethel, we have a new committee of lay leaders who are so kind, and many of them are themselves in their first year of mourning, but who came to me and who said, we want to do a better job comforting our mourners. We want to check in on them. And so we created a small Nichum Avelim committee, and I'm working with these volunteers to make check-in calls in the first year of mourning to see how people are doing and to help us as clergy know if someone could use some extra support. So that's another way that we work. And I think this example of our Nichum Avelim committee is a way that mourners, because some of them are themselves still in mourning, also connect to each other. And I think minyan is another way that mourners connect to each other. If many of our mourners are at evening minyan or morning minyan, every day they can be in community with others who are also in a similar stage of grieving. Any other ideas for communal? Yes, Joseph. To say Kaddish for 1 year. Yes. To say it for someone else, if someone is unable to. There is for some people a practice that if you're unable to do it, to designate someone else to say Kaddish. So sharing that obligation, that's a beautiful example I didn't think of. So now I want to shift to my third topic that is still about individual and shared grief. And this is going to be preparing us for Yom HaShoah next week, which will be Wednesday evening and Thursday. Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is not only a religious holiday for Jews around the world. Memorial Day is a better word than holiday. In Israel, Yom HaShoah is a national Memorial Day. Ceremonies and services are held in many community gathering spaces. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who has experienced this, air raid sirens are set off throughout the country for Yom HaShoah. I was there 1 year in Kikar Tzarfat at the fountain, Paris Square. Almost everyone stopped what they were doing. The cars stopped and people got out of their cars. We all stood in silence for 2 minutes until the sirens finished. This moment of halting, physically and emotionally and spiritually, was both individual and shared. I was remembering in the silence in my own heart my grandfather, Meir Megdal, Zichrono Livracha, who was a survivor and who had just died 3 months earlier. I was remembering his testimony and the words and images that he shared with me throughout my life. The faces of his sister and his mother and his father and everyone else in his family who was murdered. In my own grief, so soon after my grandfather's death, I remembered in those 2 minutes of the siren his losses. which are, of course, not the same as my losses, but they are also not wholly different. His family is my family too. As a Jewish people, we know that survivors are dying. There are very few alive today who, like my grandfather, were adults and survived through the camps. We hope that all those survivors, of course, we hope they live to 120 and share their stories as long as they are able. But we know that the time is limited for that. And if we are no longer individual mourners ourselves, my grandfather was an individual mourner, this does not mean that we should move on or get over it, get on with it. We must continue to transform the many individual family tragedies into our collective memory as Jews. We must take this on as shared grief. The sirens, the ceremonies, the candles, these are our mourning practices as a people. When we remember the bitterness of a slavery that our ancient ancestors experienced as if it were our own on Passover, and when we create a warm communal embracing Shiva house with good food, or at Minyan, when we comfort mourners, when we allow them to say Mourner's Kaddish, when an entire country stands still for Yom HaShoah Sirens, and when we observe around the world, mourning is both an individual and a shared experience. We mourn and we remember together. We share the sirens. Shabbat Shalom, and I wish us a meaningful Yizkor, which will be next, and that we enjoy the last bits of our Chag Sameach.